Director of the International Relations Council. Many friendly faces in the audience. So if you're not aware, the International Relations Council is an organization based here in Kansas City. We've been in existence since 1955 with the mission of encouraging civic responsibilities, civic discussions, and really promote civil discourse around international events and world issues here in Kansas City. We're incredibly excited to be having Nicholas Kralev in from Washington, D.C. for this evening's program. We've had a full day here in Kansas City. We had a morning program over at UNKC, spoke to a comparative politics class, and then we were just up at William Jewell speaking to an intro to world politics class, and now we're here. This conversation comes in a very timely manner. There's a lot of news coverage to digest right now. I think hopefully this provides a little bit more context for where we're at today and where we're headed in the future. So there's a lot to get through this evening. I'd just like to say there's some water in the back if anybody gets thirsty. If you'd like to use the restroom, you just head out this door. The men's restroom is to the left. The women's restroom is to the right. And if anybody gets uncomfortable with temperature or can't hear anything at any point in the program, just tap me on the shoulder and we'll get you taken care of. But first, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator for this evening. Matthew Roth is the Distinguished Chair for Diplomatic Studies at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College.
I left that job 5 years ago.
Oh,
I just retired.
I'm sorry. I'm pulling an old bio here. Perhaps most importantly for this, I'm sorry. Perhaps most importantly, he over the course of more than 2 decades in the Foreign Service, he has served in Washington, D.C. at embassies across Africa and Latin America, and we're very pleased to have you moderating tonight's discussion. And we'd also like to introduce Nicholas Kralev, who is an author, diplomacy expert, and the founding executive director of the Washington International Diplomatic Academy, an independent organization that provides practical professional training in diplomacy and international affairs. He's a former Financial Times and Washington Times correspondent. He witnessed firsthand the conduct of American diplomacy while covering the State Department and accompanying Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and Madeleine Albright on their travels around the world. His books include Diplomatic Tradecraft, the first ever practical diplomacy textbook, as well as America's Other Army and Diplomats in the Trenches. His work has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and Huffington Post, and has appeared on NPR, CNN, BBC, Fox News, C-SPAN, other local stations around the country and the world. So, Nicholas, thank you so much for being here today, and please take it away.
Well, thank you very much. So, when I chose this topic, I was going to say things that either no longer valid, or even if they are, no one cares that they are. Because the reality is just so much different from what it was in November or October. But I'll try to balance between these two things. And someone asked me today about how I see the immediate future of American diplomacy, and I said that I don't think that what's been happening in the past 2 months actually has much to do with diplomacy. Even some people in the administration use the word diplomacy, I don't think actually what they do necessarily is diplomacy. Let me just preface everything by saying I don't deal with domestic politics. I'm apolitical, I'm non-partisan. I never talk about what I vote for or any of that. If I share any observations about policy on diplomacy, I would have been saying the same things if Trump had run as a Democrat. So this isn't about Republicans and Democrats or any political parties. I don't do that. I look at national interest and then how you advance the national interest through the instruments in the foreign policy toolbox, of which, of course, diplomacy is one. And I think it should be the first tool of the tool of first resort, but unfortunately, it's not always the tool of first resort. The challenges to American diplomacy, of course, did not begin in January. or last year, or 5 years ago. They began many years ago, and I'm glad that after the two things I did today at the universities where everybody wasn't alive, in the 90s or 9/11, I'm glad that many of you were alive, so we can relate to something that I will talk about. And just because of the context, right? Arguably, this is my view, but also the view of many foreign policy analysts and diplomats, like Bill Burns, for example. The highest point of American power was the early 90s, right? After the end of the Cold War, after the first Gulf War. So I think 1991 was the absolute height of American power, militarily, diplomatically, probably not economically quite yet because it became even higher. But in terms of a role model on the world stage, in terms of an example people were aspiring to, in terms of influence, the United States could do no wrong. Now, why do I know? Because I was a child in Bulgaria when this was happening. And literally, there was nothing the United States could do that anybody would object to. I mean, that was the power that this country had. The way the diplomacy was done during the Cold War was very particular because of that era. And after the end of the Cold War, the US government didn't feel that it necessarily needed to invest in diplomacy that much. Some of you may remember when the Soviet Union collapsed and the first Bush administration decided to open embassies in the former Soviet republics. They decided not to ask the Congress for funds to do that. Jim Baker said, we will open those embassies with the money we already have. Which unfortunately did not translate into too bright of a future for the people, especially the foreign service officers who were tasked with opening those embassies and starting them up. You may have heard about members of Congress who, back in the 90s, were saying publicly that they were proud they never had a passport in their life, right? And they just didn't, I think they didn't believe that we needed that much of an effort because we were getting anything that we wanted. So why invest in diplomacy when other countries were just dancing to our tune anyway? So that's why for me 9/11 is a very important threshold, a very important date in terms of American power and American diplomacy. When I say power, I don't mean only hard power, I mean soft power, which is why I'm here. I talk about an element of soft power, which is diplomacy. There are other culture certainly is an element of soft power, but diplomacy is also probably the primary one. So what did we do after 9/11? Well, unfortunately, the focus was on force, as I'm sure you remember, right? There was this talk about militarization of US foreign policy because of the war in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And it was at that time, in 2003, when I began my work on the US Foreign Service. So I was a journalist, as you heard. I started in 2000 when Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State. My first trip was with her. And then continued with Colin Powell. And so it was during his tenure in 2003 when I decided I was just curious personally, what it was like to be an American diplomat at a time when the United States had just invaded another country. Whatever the reasons were, I'm not going to debate the merits of the policy at the time, the decision to go to war. That's another. If you want to ask about it, then feel free. But this is not the point, right? The point is, I was just curious as a person. I wondered, what I would do if I were in their shoes, right? You were representing the United States, but also representing the administration and the president. And I knew that many of the diplomats thought that the war was a mistake, but their job was to make the case in those countries where they were serving that in fact it was the right thing to do, that it was necessary, right? They didn't believe that, but it's part of the job to advance the policy and to explain the policy to the governments in the context of other countries. So I got a grant from a foundation in DC to go and visit a bunch of embassies. I asked Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State, to give me access to the embassies, because you know you could just walk off the street. Actually, back in the day you could. You could literally walk off the street because the libraries were in the same building where the embassy was, and you could go and do that. After 9/11 you couldn't. But the other thing was, I didn't want just to go and visit and see the building. I wanted to talk to people. And to talk to a journalist, you need permission from, in this case, from Washington, because I was coming from Washington. And thankfully, Powell sent out an email, a cable to, I made the list of 36 posts. I remember that the first number was 36, eventually it became 80, but the first post I was listening was 36. And so Powell sent out a cable to all the embassies I was visiting, I was encouraging them to cooperate and to talk to me, and, which was of course very useful, because that's, when you don't live there and you're not there full time, you rely on other people to tell you what it is and how it is and what they do and how they do it and why we should care. This was the beginning of my interest in the US Foreign Service, so in what I call professional diplomacy. I say professional because since then, it turns out that then it sort of became the focus of my career, years later when I left journalism. This question of diplomacy as a profession just bugged me, because most people I met outside the Foreign Service, including politicians, did not think diplomacy is a real profession. Right? They saw it as an activity that people who were decently educated and moderately intelligent could figure out how to do. Right? But there wasn't anything that you needed to be trained in or on, for example, to become an ambassador. As a result, in the past half century, at least 30% of US ambassadors have been political appointees. 90% of whom have had no qualifications to practice diplomacy. They didn't get anything in terms of training or any of that, right? We've had a few that have been very, very good, and I'm not against political appointees. I think the system can benefit from them if they're good, right? If they know what they're doing, which is not the case most of the time. So when I wrote my book on the Foreign Service, which was called America's Ally Army, I went around the world to promote it, and I was curious how things were in other countries in terms of the culture of diplomacy. So at the State Department, the belief was for decades that diplomacy cannot be taught, that you have to learn it on the job, and that was the only way to learn it. We have the Foreign Service Institute, but it didn't teach much. When Powell came as Secretary of State, he was horrified that people were becoming ambassadors, career people becoming ambassadors, without a day spent in their life in leadership or management positions, and didn't know how to manage people. So at least he introduced some leadership and diplomacy courses. But what I call Tradecraft, which is what this is about, was nowhere to be found. Even today, they scratch the surface, I think. So this just bothered me, so if diplomacy is a real profession, I didn't think you could have it both ways, right? If diplomacy is a real profession, then there should be a way to teach the fundamentals of it, like the fundamental skill sets, before you actually get to do it, right? Before you get to overseas and try to actually get things done. And in terms of other countries, I was horrified. first of all, most countries in the world don't even have a proper foreign service. They have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then from time to time they send people overseas to certain embassies, but it's not a proper foreign service, it's not a proper organization like we have, or the French have, or the Germans, or the Australians, and Brits, and a few other countries. But when it comes to training, preparing people to do the job of diplomacy, it wasn't really a thing. You know, it was again on the job. You're thrown into the deep end and figure it out. If you can learn how to swim, and if you have the right person as your mentor or boss, then if you're in the right place at the right time, you got lucky and you progressed and you climbed the ladder and all that. But of course, not everybody is like it, right? So I thought about this, and could it be true that diplomacy cannot be taught in the classroom? Or you couldn't design a curriculum so when you send someone out to an embassy, they already know how to do at least the basic things, and you don't have to spend taxpayer money, right, for 5 or whatever years for them to figure out how to do their job while in the job, right? To me, it just did not make sense, that system. And so that's what I mean by lost its way. I don't necessarily mean in terms of policy, because foreign policy and diplomacy are not the same thing, right? Diplomacy is one way to carry out foreign policy, but we can carry it out through force or through intelligence as contract, right? So so I started thinking about how much we invest in diplomacy, not just this country, but globally. And for this new book, I did some research about other countries. This is just an example of 10 of them. As little as we invest, it's still more than anybody else, right? In absolute terms, not in relative terms. So India, a country of 1.5 billion people, has 850 diplomats. Ridiculous. This means that if you look at the number of embassies and consulates and other diplomatic missions they have, this means between 3 or 4 people per post. In diplomats, of course, they have local stuff. Now, in reality, the big embassies like in Washington and London have 1 dozen, 2 dozen people, and then most of Africa is left with barely 1 diplomat. Brazil, yes, 1,500 is more than 850, but Brazil is a big country, and so 1,500 I don't think is an appropriate number. And you see the rest of that clearly. Now, some countries don't publish precise numbers. So first of all, Russia and China don't publish any figures. The Brits, it was difficult. I was in London in October and I asked, they couldn't give me a number. So these are sort of educated estimates, guesstimates maybe. So the British number, I think, is fairly close to the actual number. The Russian and the Chinese numbers, I can't vouch for that. But clearly, whatever those figures might be, clearly the American Foreign Service, even as of today, is bigger than any other countries. Now, we've lost quite a few people in the last few months because of premature retirement or just people left on their own. We haven't had that big wave of firings or layoffs at state that we had at USAID and in most other agencies. And that's a result of Rubio's decision to which I think makes sense to get to know the institution before he fires 20% of it or whatever it is, if you will. Right. So this number is almost accurate as of today, and in 2 months it may not be. But it's a big number. However, if we look at the context, next. Okay, so I am not saying that the military and the foreign service should be the same size, right? Nobody, I've never met anybody who's ever said that. But a difference of 162 times, I think is a bit of an overkill, right? So the military, yes, it's supposed to defend the country, but the military fights wars, right? If diplomats do their job well, there won't be wars to fight, right? I know it sounds better in theory than in practice, but still, it's still a good point. That said, even with that 8,800 number, 162 times, I think is just ridiculous. Now, I should say the 8,000 number, these are the diplomats, what we call foreign service officers. There are other members of the foreign service. So the foreign service altogether, at the end of the Biden administration, was about 13,000. So we have people we call, confusingly, specialists. These are lawyers, and doctors and nurses, and accountants, and engineers, and right, people who are not diplomats, right? They're not officers, they're called specialists. Office managers and all that. So these were not included in that number because I was comparing apples and apples with other countries. Okay, now abroad, arguably the domain of diplomats, right? 6,800 diplomats, 170,000 uniformed military personnel. Right? Again, now 25 times is less than 162, but it's abroad, right? What are these military people doing abroad? Well, the answer is, well, we have over 800 military bases around the world, right? We need people there, so that's what we have. Okay, next. So this is just the context. So I will, just to put everything in context and make it a bit clearer in terms of how I view things and how I assess diplomatic efforts and investment in diplomacy. I wanted to put these definitions up on the screen because, unfortunately, if you ask 10 people how they define diplomacy, the definitions will be very different. If you open 3 different dictionaries, you'll have 3 different definitions of diplomacy. It's first because diplomacy is about many things. I mean, there is not just one thing. You know, diplomacy is not only about negotiation. I'm sorry, it's not. There are many other things, components of diplomacy. So I have this dual definition, which is first of all a profession and an activity. So this is the dual within dual, I think. But anyway, so a profession and an activity, right, of managing international relations on a daily basis. That's what that's the crux of what diplomats do, right? They manage relations between and among states. At the same time, they carry out the foreign policy of their government. So that's why I look at those dual tracks. And these are different things. Yes, they have a lot in common, and you have to do them in parallel, but managing relations with another country is not quite the same as carrying out a specific policy, right? And I know that most of the public can't really conceptualize that, but it is what it is. Okay, so in the foreign policy toolbox, I mentioned the other 2 main tools, force and intelligence and spycraft. Of course, there are others. Something called trade, right? That's a tool in the foreign policy toolbox. These days we have, of course, foreign aid and development, we have cultural diplomacy, and sports diplomacy, and educational exchanges and all that. You know, and the implementation of those foreign policies, of course, are done by engaging with other countries, but not only by engaging. And here is the key for me: influence. We don't have embassies because we like to have a building with the flag flying in front of the building, right? Or to send the ambassador to do speeches here and there, right? We have embassies because we like to have influence over the decisions, behavior, and policies of other countries. Other countries have embassies in Washington because they want to have influence over what we do. Okay, so next one. When it comes to what I call tradecraft, I'm just not just I, but anyway, people. Tradecraft is easy to define and not so easy to actually learn how to do. Because again, it takes time and it takes practice. So the set of duties and responsibilities, and of course the skill sets that help you perform those duties, comprise what I call deploying tradecraft. So when I was done with my previous book tour and I see what various countries do in terms of training or the lack of training of their diplomats, I thought maybe I would challenge that belief or culture, whatever you call it, mantra, that diplomacy cannot be taught. And I spent a year trying to figure out whether there's ever been an organization or institution anywhere in the world outside of government that provided practical diplomacy training, and I couldn't find one. And then I decided to just try to create one. Thankfully, most Foreign Service officers retire in the DC area, so we have a lot of talent. Many of them retire still, at a young age, relatively. So they're very eager to pass on what they've learned to the next generation. And we put together a curriculum, so that was 8 years ago. And I decided we would only teach tradecraft, not international relations, which is an academic discipline. It's not diplomatic practice. And at the time I used to say, we teach what's not in the books. And of course now there's a book about it. But during COVID, I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we had a textbook just for us? It would save a lot of time in class because we can spend that time in simulations and other practical exercises taken from the actual experience of our instructors who are career ambassadors. And then I decided to turn to what I thought were the three biggest academic publishers, Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard. Oxford and Cambridge wanted the book, Harvard never called me back, even though I went there. Anyway, so I went to Cambridge. So yeah, I figured if we're going to do it for us, let's just do it for everybody. So even for universities, I mean, I really think academia has a role to play in this, in preparing the next generation of diplomats. Because in fact, for that reason, I structured the book so it can be used in a university course for a semester. So if a professor wanted to, I mean, they already are using it in several places in this country and in other countries, but I know I've hopefully told you not a few, but hundreds or even more at some point. So this question of curriculum, right? How do you teach diplomacy? It's been fascinating. As I've talked to people who are in charge of training in various countries. In October, I visited the several ministries in Europe. They were recently decided to focus on training. So, for example, in Copenhagen, they had just established their own academy at the ministry last January. In Brussels, they didn't have an academy; they had an office, and so I met with the new class of 30. Back in, they came in September, I met them in October. And the lady who was in charge of training for the Belgian Foreign Ministry said, I can't wait to read your book because I want to steal some of your exercises. Every chapter has at the end 2 or more exercise scenarios that can be used, whether it's a professor at university or someone else. That were taken, for the most part, from real life. These were cases or scenarios that embassies have to deal with. I did it as an edited book, meaning that I wrote some of it, but also some of the instructors of my academy drafted some of the chapters. Some of you may have heard the name Tom Pickering. Maybe he was here to the table. That's right. Yes. So, for example, he and I wrote the chapter on negotiation, which is the last one, and of course, Tom Pickering was an ambassador 7 times, including at the UN during the first Gulf War. So he certainly has the experience to do that. As I travel around, ask people about, I don't know why, maybe Jeff and Matthew and our colleagues from USID can give us an idea about why do people who practice diplomacy find it so difficult to come up with a way to teach it, right? And of course, the irony is that I was never in the Foreign Service, right? I came to this as a journalist, right, as an outsider who, thanks to Colin Powell and then the other secretaries of state, Condi Rice and Hillary Clinton, gave me the access, and of course I know over 1,000 people in the Foreign Service, but I'm an outsider. I thought that gave me actually an advantage in terms of identifying the deficiencies of the system and seeing what works or what doesn't, and all that. but at the end of the day, I found that the reason, because that's my impression, that the reason it's been so difficult for ministries of foreign affairs, just governments in particular, to come up with a practical and useful curriculum is that they look at it from an academic point of view. And I look at it, again, ironically, because again, I was never in the foreign service, I look at it from the perspective of what do you do in an embassy every day? I'm very pragmatic, right? So if you're going to be in the political section or economic section or public health, what is it that you do every day? When you go, not even when you go, when you wake up, before you go to the office, what it is you do, right? When you go to the office, okay, how do you manage a bilateral relationship with another country? How do you do that, right? It's a simple question. Now the answer is not very simple, but it's a simple question. And I think it's a relatable question and a very logical one. Well, how do you do it? How do you write cables? How do you report to write a cable? Right? How do you cultivate sources in a foreign country? How do you analyze economic data in a foreign country? Right? How do you advise your people back at headquarters when they make decisions so they make informed decisions? Right? How do you communicate to a foreign public if you are a public diplomacy officer? Right? What about consulate? What does giving people or interviewing people for visas have to do with diplomacy? Most people don't think it has anything to do with diplomacy, but it does. Read the book. Anyway, so in other words, for me, I mean, this may sound very arrogant, I suppose, but for me, it was not that difficult to figure out what to teach. And I'm glad that Cambridge and Oxford validated me by not, giving me full freedom. They did not either ask me to include anything or to exclude anything or change. They didn't change anything. I mean, I'm the co-author and the editor of the book, so I'm the editor. They had a proofreader, but this was, not for content. So I have complete freedom to include or not include whatever I want to. And so the product is there. So before I finish and we go to questions, I wanted to mention one other thing, which is the next slide, just to give you a sense of some of the things that I basically pulled around. Right. So this is the other difficulty people find, which is okay. How do you define the skills needed to practice diplomacy? People argue. Some people emphasize this over that. Some people, for example, I think people oversize communication, right? Overemphasize, not oversize. Overemphasize. Of course, you need communication. You need effective communication, but not communication for the sake of communication. Right? Everything is supposed to be in the name of something bigger, which is either a policy or the national interest. Right? We've heard a lot of talk about interest in the last couple of months, and at the end of the day, everything diplomats do should be in the name of the national interest, right? To advance, to either to protect or to advance the national interest. To me, the national interest is about two main things: the security and the prosperity of the country, whatever your country is. There were values, right? So values have been part of U.S. foreign policy for decades, at least since the late 70s, until recently. And some countries look entirely at naked interest, right? They don't care about values, and that's fine, it's their decision. But in terms of national interest, I've always said an effective diplomat should, whatever they do, should contribute either to the security or the prosperity of the United States. Ideally both, but in reality that's difficult to do, so at least one. And when we talk about the main skill sets, these are the ones that we focused on in the book. Some of them will be very obvious. I put empathy first because I think the best, I'm just calibrating how many seconds or minutes it will take me to, if I start something, to finish it, but maybe we can do it as part of. And that's directly related to what's been happening in the past couple of months in terms of interest. Because, okay, here's the most difficult thing to accomplish in diplomacy, and please feel free to argue with me. I think the most difficult accomplishment, and also the height of mastery in diplomacy, is to realign another country's interests. To change, you realign is a fancy word, to say to change, or to completely change, right? To reverse another country's interests. And you can also call it to reorient the foreign policy in another country. But it all begins with interest, right? If you manage to persuade another country that something that it has been doing is no longer in its interest, that is more than influence. That's just, but it is influence. But to me, it's even more difficult than that. So this is to say, how do you get another country to do something that you want them to do because it's in your country's interest, but you don't want them to do it as a result of coercion or threats, because that's unsustainable, right? You want them to do it because they come to see that doing what you want them to do is in their own interest, right? That is very difficult, and I know very few diplomats would actually do. So, I think the most effective way to achieve that, to accomplish that, is through empathy, and not sympathy, right? Which means you have to put yourself in their shoes. You have to understand, to figure out how to persuade them to, essentially you're asking them to see their circumstances, their place in the world, their own image, right? You're asking them to stop seeing themselves the way they've been seeing themselves for years or decades, and now to suddenly start thinking of their circumstances, of their place, of their well-being as a country in a very different way, right? So you have to be empathetic. You have to understand where they come from. You have to speak their language, know their history, understand their culture, their mentality, know how the government makes decisions, and what motivates them, right? If you're trying to get a country to abandon a long-held policy, right, you have to understand why this country has that policy in the first place. So that's empathy, right? And I'll give you one example, and then I can sit down, and you can join me. And that is an example of what I was just talking about. Accomplishing it's a feat. It's pulling off the complete realignment, or essentially what you achieve is another country's interests turned upside down, which means another country's foreign policy turned upside down, realigned to align better with their own interests. This is what the president of Russia has just accomplished. And as far as I can tell, in the last decade, I think he's the only leader of a country, I'm not going to say statesman, but the only leader of a country that understands all this and has actually accomplished something like this, right? When was the last time one country has influenced another to the point that other country has completely changed its foreign policy orientation? Did anyone think of anything? I mean, at the end of the Cold War in Central and Eastern Europe, they wanted to do it. It wasn't anybody's accomplishment. These countries wanted to do it as a result of getting rid of the Soviet influence and the Soviet Union collapsing and all that, right? When was the last time a country influenced without war or any other coercion? Yeah.
Nixon in China.
Yes.
That changed the dynamic. Totally.
I wasn't even born yet. So
And that was not through force, that was diplomacy.
Absolutely, I agree. But my point is, how long has it been, right? So it doesn't happen very often. And we can talk more about that if you want to, in terms of, is this only Putin's accomplishment, or was it going to happen even without Putin? That's a good question. And I'm not saying that. Well, my starting point is how he and Trump see the world, and particularly what we call the liberal world order that was established by the United States after World War II, right? Clearly, almost 20 years ago, Putin at one point concluded that the current international system, let's call it system instead of order, that the current international system was not good for Russia, right? We tried. I mean, we brought them into the WTO. We gave Russia billions in aid in the 90s, right? We tried to sort of fold Russia into the fold of the democratic states. Didn't work. Anyway, so Putin decided, okay, he didn't want to be. He always wanted to be on the same level as the United States, right? And that the current system that is now shaking didn't provide for that, right? Clearly, the U.S. was the dominant power, and it was going to be in the foreseeable future. So he decided, okay, this is the international system. It does not work for Russia. In fact, it holds Russia back, and I'm going to try to destroy it. He has tried to diminish American power, and he's succeeded. I mean, the BRICS was one of those expressions, right? To diminish American power, and that's fine. But I think at one point he figured out, wait, wouldn't it be more effective if the destruction of that system came from the inside, right, rather than the outside? And so he was extremely lucky to have a candidate for US president in 2016 who happened to also think that the current world order or system did not benefit the United States, right? And so that was what they had in common, right? For different reasons, Trump and Putin had decided that the post-World War world order was not benefiting their countries. And you can argue and all that, but that was and so what we are witnessing every day now is the destruction of that of that system, right, from the inside, and Putin couldn't be happy, right? So I'm not saying that Trump is doing this to make Putin happy. I'm not saying that. I mean, that may be the case. I'm not. I don't know because I haven't talked about it. But I'm just looking at the result. What effectively, what is leading to? It is leading to exactly what Putin has been trying to accomplish for almost 20 years. I will nudge me if you want to talk more about the topic of how you fix things. As I said, the way that I was looking at how to fix them until November last year was very different from the way I'm looking at it now, because now, I mean, all bets are off. I don't think we have a system right now, and all that. I don't know if this would be useful. Let me go to the last slide. This is just in case. I mean, I see there are some young people. I don't know if you're students, but maybe some of you have children or grandchildren who are interested in diplomacy, or at least interested in exploring diplomacy as a potential profession. I'd like to encourage more Americans to think of diplomacy for their future, because we need a new generation of diplomats. So we train working diplomats for the most part, but we have this one program in the summer, and that's the Summer Diplomatic Academy. It is for undergraduate and graduate students, and recent graduates, who would like to explore diplomacy as a career in terms of getting to understand what exactly it means. Because I don't think there is any place where you can get a sense of realistically what diplomacy is about and what you do in diplomacy. Right, so send them to this website, Diplomatic Academy of the US. The deadline is in a week, so be expeditious. And all our instructors, as I said, are career ambassadors. And so everything is from experience. We don't do theory, we don't do academics, it's all from experience. Whoever comes they have to be accepted, but we'll take care of that. And so they will learn from some of the best. Okay, let me stop here and make sure there is enough time for questions and discussion. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, for the very in-depth and introspective discussion on diplomacy. My name is Matthew Roth. As Nicholas mentioned, there have been a significant number of retirements in the Foreign Service and the diplomatic service in the United States recently. I retired 10 days ago. I was most recently the Consul General of the United States in the state of Sonora in northern Mexico. And before that, I had been in charge of our office in Washington, D.C. that led our initiatives in the Andean region of South America. Starting with a kind of a broad policy question, traditionally the national security strategy of the United States has three pillars. You've talked about defense, and it also contemplates diplomacy and also development. With the recent changes in this administration towards development, how do you see those two pillars working, and what do you see the future being for the national security strategy of the United States?
Okay, so he's talking about Hillary's 3Ds, okay? When she was Secretary of State, she came up with this, the three stools at the table, right? Defense, diplomacy, and development. The reality is every president comes out with this national security strategy, and they're not all the same. Although, of course, most of the pillars are usually the same. So development. The debate about development has been interesting because when Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State, she did make some changes. She said she was trying to get our development assistance and our development policies to be more in line with our foreign policies in general. USID was always under the authority of the Secretary of State, even when it was an autonomous agency, right? It was Condoleezza Rice who created that office, the F office at State, right? The Deputy Secretary for this and that and foreign aid. So USID was always part of the State Department family. USID is part of the Foreign Service, or was, I guess, at this point. So the Foreign Service is not entirely State Department. We have the Foreign Commercial Service, Department of Commerce, Foreign Agricultural Service, and USDA, right? Of course, the USDA, and the VOA was part of the Foreign Service, right? We had VOA correspondents who were Foreign Service officers. We even have had, so the Peace Corps would take part in the country team, right? But it would not be part of the Foreign Service. Anyway, so whether development and foreign assistance will be part of the big strategic picture at this point. I don't want to predict the future because I can't. But so even if we look past this administration, here is the biggest problem for me. The confidence and the trust that the rest of the world had in this country is gone. Right? It will be extremely difficult in the future, whoever comes to power, to persuade the rest of the world that something that they would do will stick. Right? I mean, we've always known that in a democracy, you change government, different parties come to power and all that. But for the past 80 years, the bedrock of American foreign policy has been pretty much the same during Republican and Democratic administrations, right? Because they agreed on the fundamental national interest and the fundamental role of the country in the world, right? That's why through such different presidents as Carter and Reagan and Clinton and Bush, right? Yes, things changed. At the time, we thought the changes were huge, but looking back, turns out, well, they're not that huge, right? Well, you could make the case that if Gore had become president in 2000, that there would not have been another Iraq war, right? In theory, you can make that case. But now W. Bush looks like a a moderate Democrat compared to, right? I mean, it's just, right. So I don't think anybody, if someone can tell you that they know what's going to happen with development and the foreign assistance as part of this strategic picture, and we just don't know. You would think that at some point the Democrats will bring it back, but we thought that Joe Biden was going to get rid of all the tariffs from the first Trump term, and he didn't. Right? So clearly that space will have to be filled by someone else. And that's either charitable organizations or other countries or whoever. People say China, well, China doesn't do things just out of the goodness of their heart, right? So
that leads into the next question. How has the politicization of foreign policy in recent years impacted the work of career diplomats?
Okay, so I have 3 other books in my head, new books that I haven't written yet. One of them is about diplomacy and politics. The point will be, what did I call it in my head? Some sort of dysfunctional marriage or something. Anyway, well, the truth is, they go hand in hand. As much as we don't want politics to influence diplomacy, get over it. It does, and it always will, right? Because the politicians are in charge. I mean, they are elected. No, the career diplomats are not elected, right? They report and are accountable to political leaders. I think the smart countries, well, countries are not smart, people are smart, but the smart people who lead certain countries understand, in particular states, that I'm not advocating a better investment in diplomacy for the sake of diplomacy. I'm doing it because diplomacy done right and effectively helps the policymakers, right? Helps the politicians, the political leaders, to carry out their own policies. They may come up with the most beautiful, wonderful, whatever, precious policy you've ever seen in the history of the world. If there's no one to implement it, what good does it do? What will sit in someone's shelf as a piece of paper or in someone's head, right? You need people, you need public servants to carry out the policy. So if we had more leaders who understood the value of diplomacy, they would know that diplomacy done right can benefit their own policies, right? Their own agenda. Right? And that's why I can't, intellectually, I can't wrap my mind around this, right? Why are politicians so distrustful of diplomats? This is almost everywhere, certainly in this country, but in many other countries. There is just something inherently distrustful, right? It's more for the politicians toward diplomats than the other way around. At least that's my impression, and I can't give you, scientific evidence of it. But it's just there's some weird way of, how politicians look at diplomats and have this notion that diplomats are there to carry out some other agenda, right? I know people in the foreign service. Well, okay, maybe 1 or 2 of them, of the 1,000 I've met, at some point tried to do something that had to do more with their interest than the national interest or the administration's interest. But 99.999% of them understand what the job is, and the job is, regardless of who's in the White House, what party is in power, your job is to carry out those policies, right? And there's been this perception, especially among Republicans for the last several decades. This has been a suspicion of diplomats, and that they're carrying out some sort of liberal agenda. I know people who voted for Trump in the foreign service. I know people who didn't hide back in the first term, who were in senior positions at embassies, overseas, that they have voted for Trump. Right? So it's not true that most diplomats are Democrats. That is just factually, I don't think it's true. Do more than 50% vote Democratic? Well, perhaps, I don't know. I can't prove it. It's possible, but there are plenty of people in the foreign service who've been voting Republican for decades.
And I I think that actually then flows into the next question is, what do you think drives the disconnect between public understanding, political understanding of diplomacy, and what diplomats actually do?
For me, everything, including what's been happening in the last couple of months, it all goes back to education, or the lack of it. So this debate about whether the system that the United States designed after World War II, right, the world order, whether that was good for this country or not, right, that debate. Well, that debate was never had in this country. Most Americans don't understand what this system is and how it works, right? Most people in other countries don't understand what this system is, right? So I think it's a failure of the education system that most Americans don't understand how the US government works, how the country works as a society, how the private sector works, how the non-profit sector works, and how the world works. I don't think most Americans understand this. So how can they judge for themselves whether this world order is good for them or not, right? And so here comes Trump and says that this world order has been completely bad for the country because other countries have been ripping us off and raping this and that and whatever, right? We've been paying for their security and all that stuff, right? People don't have enough information and understanding to make their own conclusions. And I would argue that the last 80 years have been the most secure, stable, and prosperous era in human history. Right? Yes, there is extreme poverty. Yes, there are wars and other conflicts and all that. Yes, there are a lot of bad things. The United US government's administrations have made terrible foreign policy mistakes. Yes, but overall, as objectively as I can do it, I cannot find another period in history, whether it's 2 centuries ago or 20 or BC or whatever, right? A period in history during which there's been such stability and prosperity for much of the world. And I think that it's precisely this world order that the United States created that's been responsible for that stability and prosperity, right? You can say that's my opinion. I think you could prove this objectively if you especially historians can do it. But who made this case to the American people? Which president or Secretary of State went out there and made the case to the American people, right, to explain why, in fact, this system is good for us? Okay, even if they had, would most Americans have understood it? I don't think so, because it's in the middle school and high school where they should be given the basics of this world order and how things work, so they can then understand when the president gives a speech and talks about the benefits of this or that, right? This makes it easy to manipulate people, of course, right? Whether through social media or through just on the campaign trail. This is a big project, right? In terms of the education system, I'm sure you've been hearing all about this civics, bringing back civics to schools. Yes, there are some schools in this country that still teach civics, but there are also many that don't, right? And then the other question is, even back in the day when they did teach civics, what exactly were they teaching? I mean, did anyone explain how the United States prevailed in the Cold War? Or do we just take that for granted and right? There are schools in this country where you will have teachers that will talk about this, right? The reasons that the Cold War came to an end much earlier than pretty much everybody predicted, right? Yeah, but how many kids have been in a class that would discuss such a thing, right? And it's because people don't connect the dots between their daily lives and everything that they're accustomed to, that take for granted, whether it's their gadgets from Apple that are assembled in China, or the gas that comes from whatever country at the pump, or the avocados coming from Mexico, or whatever, right? So that they don't connect the dots between that, which has become part of their everyday life, part of their living standards, which are going to go down very soon, by the way, provided the trade war continues. And so the dot between that, their reality of every day, and big thing we call the world order, right? The reason it's so easy to find products from various countries here is precisely because of the system that we've designed and with the help of other countries. And you can debate the merits of the idea of bringing manufacturing back to the United States, but you also have to acknowledge that the everyday life of Americans will change because they just don't think about. And I always tell people, could go home, open your closet or whatever, your fridge or right, and just look. Where are all these things coming from? So if that country stops importing into the United States, either because of high tariffs or whatever reason, right, you will not get these things anymore. And in 99% of the time, this country isn't ready to produce these things tomorrow or next year. It will take time, right? So again, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying we need to think about consequences. And nobody's doing this in DC right now, right? This president isn't programmed to work this way. He doesn't think about consequences. Typically you would task your either your advisors or in the case of foreign policy, the NSC or the National Security Council, right? The president will have an idea or will want to change policy or come up with a policy. Then he will task what we call the interagency, which is all the agencies that have a stake in foreign policy, like state and defense and commerce and treasury, right, and others. Then there'll be meetings where there'll be endless meetings and all that. So at least I don't want that necessary. But the point is, then the government, right, the experts will come up with policy ideas, with a plan. They'll think through the consequences. They will think about how to respond if another country retaliates on this or that, right? So you're prepared to act because it's in your interest, right? Then they will present what their findings are or their recommendations are to the president. Ultimately, it's his choice. But Obama didn't say, let's restore relations with Cuba tomorrow. No, he tasked. First of all, it was secret, but he had a task force, right? And they took almost a year to come up with recommendations of whether to do it and how to do it, right? They met secretly with the Cubans. The Canadians hosted it. Now they're not going to do anything about it like that anymore. But the point is, this is the time to think things through, right? And come up with a sensible policy and then start implementing it. Not to do this and say, beginning at midnight, this or that. No, you haven't heard what your experts think of this, right? Even the smartest president or person in the world acknowledges that he doesn't know everything about everything, right? That's why you have experts in the government. That's why you have a cabinet, right? It says a lot that he clearly doesn't trust his own cabinet. I mean, I don't blame him when I look at them, I wouldn't trust them either. But he picked them, right? Clearly he picked them for the wrong reason. And of course we've known that from the beginning, right? That it was loyalty that what was important and not expertise. So this is, I think, what I miss the most. And it sounds very bureaucratic to say, I miss the process. Well, but I think it's better for the country. It's better for the interest of the country before a policy is announced or carried out to be thought through and to have a debate. Sometimes you may argue, and that's fine, as long as it's a healthy debate. And all we're doing with the way we're doing it now is just confusing the rest of the world and making it worse for ourselves, right? Because look at with all this time with all these weeks ago with the tariffs, right? Suddenly, nothing for 90 days, right? So the stock market goes up 30,000 points today, right? And it's just sending, I think, the wrong message, and that's why I say that I don't think the trust that other countries had in this country will be restored, probably even not in my lifetime.
Just want to open the floor to other questions.
Just like three brief questions, please.
So I want to get back to the subject at hand. Considering the Secretary of State is a political appointee without Tradecraft training, any of the Secretary of States, how do you inculcate a culture of valuing the teaching of tradecraft when that individual doesn't necessarily embrace that tradecraft?
That is a deep question, and I can talk about it until next week. I won't. So this goes back to politics and diplomacy, and also to the lack of understanding of the benefits of diplomacy for oneself, or if you're a politician, right? It's the tradition is that foreign ministers, which is what the Secretary of State is, right? That's across the world, are most of the time political people, political appointees. They're politicians, and many of them are actually party leaders, right? For example, there's a tradition in Germany that the head of the smaller party in the governing coalition will be the foreign minister. So yeah, when the Greens, when the Social Democrats were in power 20 years ago, and the Green Party was the junior partner in the coalition, Joschka Fischer, who was the head of the Green Party, became the foreign minister. When the FDP, which is the Free Democrats, came into the government with Angela Merkel in 2009 as a junior partner, their head, Guido Westerwelle, became the foreign minister, and accidentally the first openly gay foreign minister in the world, but she passed away from cancer a few years ago, unfortunately. So this is, I was in Brussels in October, and I had this student come up and say, why do politicians always become foreign ministers and most of them have no expertise in diplomacy? And I said, are you from Greece? He said, yes. Well, because the accent was very clearly Greek. So this is to say that this is a tradition in Greece as well, right? Politicians become foreign ministers. I can't explain why that is, but it's a long tradition in the world in general, and it just reinforces my point that politicians don't really understand that diplomacy is a profession. It's a set of skills that you need to have to be effective in diplomacy, and they rely on. This is going to be probably a contradiction here, but here's what they do say. They say, well, we have the public servants, we have the career people, right? The career diplomats. So it's okay that the foreign minister or the Secretary of State is not an expert or doesn't have the training, because we have all these career people that know what they're doing. Well, except that, first of all, we don't really value them that much, and we don't have enough of them, right? And then we think that they're disloyal, and they have their own agenda. Okay, so then what the hell do we do? Right, so it's kind of a catch-22. Now, I do think, though, that the United States is a worthy exception sometimes from this tradition of politicians becoming foreign ministers, because of the 4 secretaries of state I traveled with and I covered, Albright, it's funny that we always call the female secretary of state by their first name and the male ones by their last name. Right? We would say Madeline and Hillary and Condi, and then we say Powell, not Condi. Anyway, discrimination. Of the 4 that I covered, only Hillary had, you can say she was a politician, right? Albright wasn't a politician. She was an academic. She was a professor. Condi was also a professor in this again. And then Powell, of course, was what he was. Jim Baker. Was Jim Baker a politician? Well, he looked like one. Well, here's the thing. Jim Baker, actually, I didn't know this, but until I read the book about him a couple years ago. In his youth, relative youth, he did run for Congress. He just didn't win. I think that was the case. But he's never held elected office. He was always an appointee, right? He was White House Chief of Staff, he was Treasury Secretary, he was Secretary of State. So I suppose you can argue, but this was because of his relationship with Bush, right? So you can argue whether he was a politician, but the United States is, I think, an exception when it comes to politicians and secretaries of state. Even though Powell, was never trained as a diplomat. No one argued with that choice at the time, right? People thought he was absolutely qualified to be Secretary of State, and that tells you how people think about the skills one needs to actually be the Secretary of State, right? Oh, he was a general, absolutely qualified. Okay, does that mean that an ambassador qualifies to be a general? Clearly not. So yes, let's move on. So I think there was someone here.
Yeah, I was going to ask more specifically about your academy. Does the State Department recommend that people go to it? Do the people who go to it, are they already Foreign Service officers and they do that? Or does it help people who want to get into the Foreign Service? Does the academy give them a step up in doing that?
Yeah, the answer to the last question is yes. But okay, so we have no affiliation with the government, and I don't want the State Department recommending or not recommending. So I stay away from that. Clearly, I have a connection with the State Department, and I've also served on promotion boards in the Foreign Service. These are not promoting the Foreign Service, but promoting the people from one grade to another. So we do not train American diplomats. We train foreign diplomats. And we also train what I call aspiring diplomats. So yes, so we have alumni who have joined the Foreign Service, the US Foreign Service, but that was before they voted for the government, right? The State Department has the Foreign Service Institute. Now, unfortunately, they teach almost no tradecraft there, right? They teach technical skills like consul, how to do visas, how to help American citizens in trouble abroad, how to manage public diplomacy programs and all that, right? But that's to me not technical than tradecraft. Anyway, so it's hard to justify paying a private academy to train your people when you have an institute that's supposed to do that for free, not for free, but it's funded by the government, right? So that's the answer. Foreign diplomats come all the time. We've had the Baltic states send people every year. Then we had Japan, South Korea, Guyana, a couple of African countries. But also people who either considering changing careers. We've had people. In the same core class, we may have people from their 20s to their 50s. People who are thinking of changing careers, and then there are people who don't want to change careers. They just want to use the skills to in whatever they're doing. It may be multinational business. It may be the non-profit sectors, foundation, think tank type things. Because most of these skills are easily transferable and applicable to many other professions, yes.
One more question?
Jim Dobson, retired USA. I think, I want to go back to Putin. I think Putin's foreign policy for his nation is pretty clear, pretty focused, and there's commitment there from him. And I would suggest that our foreign policy hasn't been that clear. Maybe since 1991, when George H.W. Bush and before him Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan used to talk about, what's my goal? I want to compete, I want to challenge, and I want to win and destroy the Soviet Union. And that kind of happened. And perhaps since 1991, we have not had a foreign policy of the United States government that is that clear and focused and has, everyone's commitment. And it's hard to judge diplomats on what they're doing if the foreign policy objectives are not clear, are not focused, and if you haven't put together commitment to them. I just like your comments.
Yes, I agree with that. I don't think Reagan ever said that his goal was destruction of the Soviet Union. I don't think he ever said that. The way nobody
we
thought,
want to win. He said we want to win.
Nobody thought that the Soviet Union can be destroyed. Let's face it. And if they say they did, they're wrong. Anyway, but yes, fundamentally, you're right. So what happened in the 90s after the Cold War was won, so to speak, suddenly there were so many interests right? So many priorities that it became impossible to come up with a coherent foreign policy mission. Right? This was very clear in the Clinton years, very clear. When I first met Albright all those years ago, she used to tell me that there are many humanitarian interests that rise to the level of the national interest. That had to do, of course, with Bosnia and the Balkans and Kosovo and all that. Well, it was, quite fuzzy, right? It's not. I think you could have made a better case of why getting rid of Milosevic was in the U.S. interest than maybe they made the case at the time, but that was my first trip with Albright was actually the very day we were flying from Egypt back to DC. That was when Milosevic fell from power in Belgrade. Yeah. So it is certainly true. Now you would have thought that 9/11 would have been the catalyst to correct that, right? That would have provided focus. Unfortunately, it was the wrong focus. Meaning, revenge was the focus. And as much as we had to have somehow avenged those thousands of deaths of 9/11, that's never a good reason to come up with a policy, right? And certainly it's never a good policy. So I thought the United States just completely blew a huge chance it had after 9/11 to recalibrate its foreign policy, to restate its foreign policy, and to also even increase and magnify its power globally, including soft power. And of course, we lost a lot of soft power because of the wars and also because of the treatment of certain American citizens in this country, whether they were guilty or not, right? Remember those arrests that turned out to be, now we have something similar with the migrants and all that. Absolutely, I think it's the fault of the failure of the Bush administration to see the bigger picture. Some things have to be done, I agree with that. Of course, the Iraq War was one of them, but a signal had to be sent to the world in terms of global terrorism. I think the things that they did in terms of cutting financing for terrorist groups was the right thing to do, and they did it so quickly and effectively, it was actually amazing. It is one of the examples in one of the chapters in the book of how this was done after 9/11, because nothing existed to counter terrorist financing back then. And they did it in a few weeks within the United Nations, which is the other thing, right? Because they didn't do it they did it within the UN framework, but they did it multilaterally. So the chance was missed. I think it was squandered after 9/11 to just sit down and think. So what do we want, right? What do we want in 10 years? What do we want in terms of American power? How do we see American power? And how do we get there? That was never a calculation. There was never a meeting. I lived all through I was 20. I just graduated from the Kennedy School right before 9/11. So I was still in my mid-20s, but I was all through that. Unfortunately, Powell never even broached the subject of an alternative path to what they were doing, to what Cheney and Rumsfeld were spearheading in terms of priorities. Right? Just the State Department never offered an alternative option in terms of the direction of the United States as the main power in the world, which is why it was so heavily military, the response, and just now, of course, when Conde became Secretary of State, she started using different language. Yeah, of course, she was not in charge of diplomacy. I must tell you, there is the book that I'm most likely to write first, of all the 3 or 4 that are in my head, is a book about the 4 Secretaries of State that I covered. And it would, if I find time to do it, it would be part a memoir of my time with them, part about the relationships between and among them, because they're very interesting in their own right, and then part an assessment of their tenure as Secretary of State. And unfortunately, despite the many things that Colin Powell did right, and despite the stature he had, and It was amazing. You know, we would be in a foreign country, we would just be in the lobby of a hotel, he would just walk in and people would start clapping. For no reason. Because he just walked in. Right? Who does that? I mean, for whom do people do that? Right? They'll never do it for Bush, or certainly not Cheney. Right? They did it for Powell. And he didn't use that stature I mean, unfortunately, he did good things for the State Department, internally as an institution, and you know, when he became Secretary of State, every embassy had only one computer. That was it. Literally. There was one computer in the entire embassy in 2001. Yes. He changed that. He decided to put a computer on every officer's desk. Right? So this is part of when I say the things we take for granted, and things will change. Even just because of the trade wars and all that, we will lose a lot of the things we're used to, and that's why people, you know, the experts are saying that living standards will plummet because of that. But I wish Powell had, and maybe because of the previous question about politicians and, you know, people becoming Secretary of State without the qualifications to practice diplomacy. As great as Powell was, yeah, that was a deficiency, and I will. There's something that he told me after he left office that he asked me not to publish while he was alive, which had to do with how he felt in the second Bush term when he was out of office and Connie became Secretary of State. He felt betrayed because he accused her, and I, of course, before I print any of that, I'll have to speak with her and make sure that she's not surprised by this, but he hated the way that she let me try not to offend her. When she became Secretary of State, she said things and behaved as if she was inventing the wheel. I mean, she said we will be doing things now in terms of diplomacy because and she said literally, she said the time for diplomacy is now. And in private Powell was like, I went to see him once in his office, and he said, "What the hell did you think you were doing in the first 4 years?" Right? And she always says publicly that they were friends. That's not what he thought. Right? So, all right. Well, thank you.
Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your expert moderation. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. If you're not a member, I very much encourage you to do so. irckc.org. Membership really helps us put on programs like this. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.